Simon Davis, like Jonathan Spence, Sir Chris Clark, Dipesh Chakraborty. And not only have these historians admired your work, but they have said that they have learned from you. What do you think they have learned from you? Is it new archives, new sources, or new connections of global history, new networks, or a completely new use of historical imagination altogether?
Well, thank you. Yes, I feel very, very fortunate that these great historians have read my work sympathetically and have spoken well of it. I feel really blessed because I think historians are not known for their generosity necessarily to their colleagues. But I mean, I feel very fortunate in that. But I will say one thing, I think most great historians like Natalie or Chris or Jonathan Spence, the reason they start writing history is because they loved reading historical fiction. It's historical fiction that brings them into history, and that's what makes them initially engaged with history, that it makes the past alive in some way. And certainly when I was studying history in Delhi University, you didn't get the sense that the historians there had come into history through fiction. I mean, they were sort of like, these heavy social scientist types who were sort of interested in crunching numbers and so on. And I think one of the reasons for that is exactly because, plausible fictions of the past didn't exist, and I do hope that, people will start telling different stories about the Indian past, because I think to leave it only to historians is irresponsible.
That's good one. That's the next one.
About a point about the uses of historical fiction.
The way history
I'm thinking of what I always think of as the greatest historical novel of the second half of the 20th century, which is this magnificent novel by Mario Vargas Llosa called The War at the End of the World, which is a novel based very much in a historically grounded insurrection that takes place in Brazil. It's a kind of millenarian insurrection. There's this charismatic preacher who, in the Badlands and the hinterland of Brazil, creates this ragtag army of the poor. And the novel essentially deals with how this completely corrupt Republican establishment and its completely corrupt and gaudy army and its equally corrupt journalists deal with this record, understand and engage with this extraordinary and bizarre insurrection. And sometimes I think that who can actually say that The War of the End of the World is not actually a truer account of a dozen great insurrections and a dozen corrupt republics than all the hundreds of books that have been written in this fragmentary way. Because when I read it, I think, every Indian civil servant and every Indian soldier who's ever worked in Kashmir or in the Northeast should actually read this as a text. Every television anchor who reports on circumstances of great violence and great emotion should read this, because it is a magnificent novel which takes history as its subject, but sets in motion real characters who are fictionalized and fictional characters who stand for institutions and also are functional characters in themselves, and creates a reality which is truly magnificent and powerful.
Yes, I'd like to say that, I really admired this novel by Mario Vargas Llosa that you spoke of, but I'd like to remember here one very great Bengali novel, similarly of the last half of the 20th century. This is Akhtaruzzaman Ilyas's Khwabnama, which I think is probably the greatest Bengali novel written in the 20th century. And again, it makes this kind of very extraordinary use of his historical material in order to create a completely, a kind of supernatural reality. So the natural and the supernatural are completely fused in that work. But I'd like to make a further point about something that Amitabh said about, that he put very movingly about finding, looking at Indian history and finding a blank because there are not enough sources, and especially about the lives of ordinary people. The great mass of people who lived and died and suffered have left no written records with which to, to recreate their lives. So those lives have to be imagined. You spoke also of the mass, and I wanted to come to a distinction that is sometimes made in judging historical fiction, that on the one hand you have imagined characters who very often belong to this class of ordinary people, the suffering millions as it were, and there is the world historical figure. Who is sometimes used to legitimize the fiction, like an encounter with Napoleon, or suddenly the Duke of Wellington appears, or whatever. And I find it really remarkable and powerful, Amitabh, that you don't use that kind of person, that you don't need to rely on what Lukács called the world historical fiction, the world historical figure, in order to legitimize your fiction. That your fiction is genuinely about those who are not, whose presence, of course, is there in the archive, but who have not left their own witness. They have not testified themselves to their experiences. So it is really a feat of the imagination to bring them back, and it is for that reason that fiction is so important, important to the historian too, because what can the historian do if the archive doesn't provide the material? The historian can only ground her or his empathy on the empathy of a literary writer. And that, I think, is very, very important with the work that both Mukul and Amitabh have done.